You can't swear in the first 30 seconds of a YouTube video, which is what I need to do in order to express the geopolitical situation in the Middle East. It's become a modern joke about how ineffective and broken many of the governmental structures are in the Middle East, but not that many people know the reason why. There's many correct answers you can give, like colonialism and its effect on the borders, mismanagement of oil funds, and radicalism, but I want to cover the aspect that isn't necessarily covered by a lot of people: the Saudi-Iranian conflict. The two countries are built on different versions of Islam and use their money to support radical groups in other countries. Ever since the Iranian Revolution, the divide between the two countries has grown more and more. So now that we understand that, I'm going to cover some of the conflicts and how this proxy war is what drives them. Saudi Arabia and Iran's rivalry isn't the only thing that drives these conflicts as well, and there's a ton of other parties involved, especially in this one that I'm about to cover. The Syrian civil war started around the Arab Spring protests of 2011. Many different factions sprung up to try to seize power from the current leader, Bashar al-Assad. The al-Assad government is backed by Russia, because Russia and Syria have a deal to allow Russian warships to use the Syrian port in Tartus, which allows them to bypass any blockade of the Bosphorus Straits and lets them project their power into the Mediterranean. The US, in order to counter Russian influence, supports the Kurdish rebel group, the Syrian Democratic Front. This directly contradicts Turkey's goals, with Turkey wanting to suppress the Kurdish resistance as much as possible. Going into the rivalry between the Kurds and the Turks would need to be a whole video, so just know that these people got beef. Turkey is also trying to establish a sort of safe zone in the north of the country through military action. Turkey and the US both have opposing interests despite being in NATO together, and unfortunately this has just resulted in the Syrian people having to go through the pain of the civil war. Al-Assad has been heavily criticized for his chemical weapon attacks on his own civilians. Iran supports Al-Assad and his regime, which makes their ties with Russia increase, with them supplying drones during the Ukraine war. This makes the US reluctantly support Saudi Arabia and support the Kurds more willingly. Saudi Arabia has mostly supported the Al-Qaeda affiliate, the Al-Nusra Front, and the Free Syrian Army, which has caused tensions with the US after their campaign against them. The Yemeni civil war started when the Iranian-supported Houthis overran the capital, which was controlled by the Saudi-supported government. This war has been especially brutal over the time. The UAE supports the southern Yemen group even though they're allied with Saudi Arabia, and has helped supply their offensive against the Houthi rebels. Alright, I'm gonna move on to Israel and Palestine, and I have to try my best to not offend anyone. Israel is allied alongside Saudi Arabia mostly out of convenience. Iran supports the Hamas group, who came to power in the Gaza Strip in Palestine. In 2006, the Palestinian Party had a civil war with the less radical Fatah group remaining established in the West Bank, while the more radical Hamas group came to power in the Gaza Strip. The Israelis imposed a harsh blockade on the Gaza Strip because Iran had been sending weapons to the Hamas group, who were using them on Israeli civilians. The situation is stuck in a deadlock right now because Israel can't lift the blockade, because then Hamas will become more well armed with Iranian weapons. Meanwhile, Hamas is battling Fatah in the elections on the West Bank. This makes Israel pretty aggressive towards Iran when it comes to foreign policy. Just a couple weeks ago, a ton of military facilities in Iran were hit with strikes, along with trucks carrying military supplies across Iraq. It's been largely speculated that Israel was behind these. These two countries have a strong rivalry, which makes Israel fall more into the Saudi camp. Israel is the country in the Middle East that has the most direct support from the United States, which also has a deep rivalry with Iran. If you want to learn more about this conflict, channel members can get a video explaining the 6-day war and the events that led up to the current conflict and before that conflict as well. You can see that by pressing the blue button next to the subscribe button. Hezbollah is an interesting faction since it was largely created to resist the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. However, since then it's become a big Iranian proxy used to project power into Syria, Iraq, and into Israel and Palestine. We'll end it off with Iraq since the script is 3 pages long. Iraq invaded Iran in 1980 to try to stop the ongoing revolution which caused most of this in the first place. They had initial success by Khuzestan, but after the Iranians turned the momentum around, Iraq was going to lose pretty early into the war. But Saudi Arabia, fearful of sharing a border with Iran, started supporting Iraq with weapons. This drew the war out, which eventually ended with a white peace. After this, Saddam Hussein attempted to invade Kuwait, but was met with the wrath of the coalition, completely destroying his military in record time. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq again under the pretext of possession of weapons of mass destruction, which has been largely disputed. I'll give my take on it. I think this was a fair justification. Take a look at North Korea. North Korea is a repressive authoritarian state that lives on borrowed time. The reason it's still a country is because it acts as a buffer between South Korea and China, which forces it into a deadlock. No one can invade North Korea because of their possession of nukes. It acts as a preventative measure which ensures its immediate survival and makes it so the only real way the country can be taken down is from the inside. Iraq had kicked out UN atomic inspectors, which was very suspicious, and the US was worried about a similar problem like North Korea would become. The main difference between Iraq and North Korea, though, is that Iraq has between 10 to 12% of the world's oil supply, which the modern economy is heavily dependent on. Through this, one man would have the power to overproduce oil and drop the prices, or underproduce and raise prices whenever he wanted, and no one could stop him because they'd get nuked if they attempted to intervene militarily. That is why the US invaded Iraq in 2003. Am I saying the invasion and the things that happened there were justified? No, I'm not commenting on that. I just think the real reason for the invasion has been lost under some propaganda and other justified moral outrage. If anyone disagrees, feel free to leave your opinions in the comments and I'll read them. I'd like to have my mind changed and my opinions challenged right here. Anyway, it's pretty hard to dispute that the US didn't necessarily do a great job managing Iraq after the conflict, which led to it becoming a battleground between Shia and Sunni Islam groups, supported by Iran and Saudi Arabia respectively. This changed when the Islamic State started their big offensive, and the US came back to counter that. Slowly over time, Iraq has developed into an Iranian allied state with a couple of Kurdish holdouts in the north of the country. Despite all the funding they give out, Iran and Saudi Arabia largely have their own problems too. Iran has had protests going on for around 6 months Joe Biden. Iran has had protests going on for around 6 months at this point without stopping, so check out this video I made for more information. And the dictatorial structure of their country has become more criticized by their own population. The rivalry with the US and the sanctions against it have contained their economy, and they feel constricted by the US. Saudi Arabia isn't much better, with their economy being mostly driven by oil and oil alone. Their military is pretty abysmal outside from a couple of elite divisions, and their economy seriously lacks diversity. Their government always seems like it's on the brink of collapse, with oil being the only thing that holds them together. It seems like as long as the US-China rivalry remains the main dominant global force, the Middle East isn't going to rest for a while. I really wanted to make that video, so I hope you enjoyed it. See you guys later.